Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind came low across the dry New Mexico plain, pushing dust against Elias Ward's coat as he rode the narrow trail that cut between the canyon walls, his posture straight and steady, his hands loose on the reins. The sun hung pale and sharp, catching the edges of every rock and brush, and the land stayed quiet except for the sound of his horse's hooves striking the packed earth in a slow, even rhythm. Elias kept his eyes ahead, scanning the fence line the way he had done almost every morning for years, moving with the calm discipline of a man who lived alone long enough that silence became his only company. His face was partly shadowed under the brim of his old hat, but the deep lines at the corners of his eyes showed in the hard light, revealing years of strain he rarely spoke of. Dust clung to his boots. His shirt sleeves were rolled just enough to show forearms marked by past labor and past violence. He didn't ride fast, didn't ride distracted, just moved forward with the same quiet focus he used for everything. The canyon narrowed as he reached a turn, the rock walls shifting the air so the sound of his horse echoed faintly. He slowed out of habit. The fence line dipped toward a cluster of mesquite trees, their thin branches scratching at the breeze. And then he saw something that made him pull the reins tighter without thinking. Two figures hung from a low branch, barely moving. For a moment, he didn't breathe. He stared hard, making sure his eyes weren't lying. But the shapes didn't fade or shift. They were real. Two young Apache women were bound by their wrists to the branch, their feet close enough to scrape dirt when the wind pushed them, their bodies hanging weak and sun-beaten. Elias swung off the horse fast enough to kick up dust around his boots, his jaw locked tight, the memory of old army trails and the things he had seen there twisting in the back of his mind. He walked forward slowly, steadying his breath, assessing every detail the way a scout did when he wasn't sure what danger still lingered. The first woman, mid-20s maybe, hung with her head slumped against her chest, long black hair falling in loose strands despite a single braid that still held a few small feathers and beads. Her bronze skin was burned and bruised, the neckline of her deerskin dress torn roughly and the rope marks across her wrists deep and raw. She didn't react when he touched her shoulder. The second, smaller in build, early 20s, twitched at the sound of his boots on the dry earth. Her eyelids lifted halfway, revealing eyes that flickered fast with fear and instinct. Her dress was shorter, frayed along the hem as though she had been dragged. Her arms trembled from the strain of her weight hanging so long. They were alive, but only just. Elias took out his knife without a word. The blade glinted briefly before he cut the first rope, catching the older woman, Lona, before she fell. She collapsed into his arms, her breath shallow, her body shaking from dehydration and exhaustion. He laid her carefully on the ground, adjusting her braid away from her face. Then he cut the second rope. The younger woman, Asha, flinched as she dropped, her hands rising instinctively as though expecting another blow. Elias caught her under the arms, lowering her down with a slow, steady movement, giving her no reason to fear his touch more than she already did. For a few seconds, he simply knelt there between them, his breath visible in the cooling air, watching their chests rise and fall in uneven rhythm. The canyon felt tighter around him now, the walls too still, the wind too thin. He looked around once, checking the ridges, then returned to the women. He brought his horse closer, lifted Lona first onto the saddle, securing her with a blanket. Asha watched him with guarded eyes, her breathing sharp and uneven. When he reached to lift her too, she stiffened, but he didn't grab her, didn't rush. He held out his hands in a simple gesture, steady, open, waiting. After a moment, she let him lift her, though her muscles stayed tense against his arms. He mounted behind them, guiding the horse with slow, careful steps along the trail leading home. The ride was quiet, broken only by the horse's breathing and the occasional rustle of dry brush. Lona's head rested against the front of the saddle, her hair blowing across Elias's coat. Asha stayed rigid, glancing back at the canyon every few minutes, as though expecting something or someone to appear. But no one came. The land stayed empty. When Elias's cabin finally rose into view, A single-room homestead with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a split-rail corral leaning tiredly in the dirt. The sun was beginning to fall lower, stretching long shadows across the plain. He stopped the horse, slid off, and carried the women inside one at a time. The cabin filled with pale, warm daylight from the small window. Dust motes moved through the air, catching the fading sun. He laid Lona on the bed first, covering her with a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of wood smoke. Asha he placed beside her, but with a little more space, sensing the tension still in her breath. Elias moved slowly around the room, setting water to warm, splitting kindling, checking their wrists again. He didn't speak. He didn't try to soothe them with empty words. He simply worked, each motion careful and honest. When he held a cup of water to Lona's lips, she drank in weak sips, one hand rising unsteadily to brace the cup, her fingers brushing his. Her eyes opened just enough to look at him, quiet, steady, as though memorizing the shape of the man who had cut her down. Asha kept her eyes on him the whole time, the distrust plain but not hostile, just worn into her like the bruises on her skin. When he offered her water, she hesitated until she saw him step back slightly, giving her room. Only then did she drink, her hand shaking as she held the cup herself. The fire crackled low in the hearth. The room warmed slowly. Outside, the wind hit the cabin walls with a soft, hollow sound. Elias sat in the rough chair near the table, elbows on his knees, watching the flames catch new wood. He didn't look at the women directly, but kept them in his peripheral vision, alert without being intrusive. Lona's breathing softened. Asha's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. She finally couldn't fight. The quiet inside the cabin felt different now. No longer the empty silence of a man alone, but something shared, cautious, changing. Elias stayed there, steady as the firelight flickered across the room, knowing without needing to say it that the moment he cut them down had already tied all three of their fates together. Morning light slipped quietly across the worn floorboards of Elias Ward's cabin, stretching in a long, pale line from the window to the foot of the bed where Lona and Asha slept under thick blankets. The fire from the night before had burned down to soft orange coals, giving the room a steady warmth that held the chill outside at bay. Elias moved around the small space with the same slow care he always carried, his boots making almost no sound as he added wood to the hearth and poured water into the kettle. He hadn't slept much. He had sat in the chair most of the night, keeping his eyes on the bed, making sure their breathing stayed steady and that the pain in their muscles didn't pull them back in a shock. More than once, Asha had stirred sharply, reaching for something that wasn't there, her fingers curling into the blanket as if expecting ropes. Lona had slept more deeply, but with a tightness around her mouth that told him her rest wasn't peaceful. By the time the kettle began to steam, both women were shifting awake. Lona opened her eyes first. She lay still, watching the ceiling as though gathering her bearings, then turned her head slightly toward Elias. Her hair, loosened during the night, lay spread across the pillow in long, dark strands. She pushed herself upright slowly, palms flat against the blanket, her breath catching once from soreness. She didn't speak, but her gaze settled on the cabin, its simple table, the neat line of tools hanging on the wall, Elias's coat draped over a chair. Her eyes paused on Elias himself, who was rolling up his sleeves as he checked the kettle. Asha woke with a quicker movement, pulling the blanket up to her collarbone when she realized she wasn't outside anymore. Her breathing came fast for a moment until her eyes found her sister, alive, beside her, and the sharpness in her posture eased into guarded caution. She scanned the room, then the cowboy, taking in every detail of how he stood, how far he kept from them, how he looked away when she adjusted the blanket around herself. Elias turned slightly when he heard them shift. His voice came low and calm. "Water's warm," he said. "Got some broth if you can take it." Lona nodded once. Asha stayed silent. He didn't approach the bed. Instead, he set the cups on the table and stepped back, giving them room to decide whether to come forward. Lona swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as her feet touched the floor, but she kept going, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like a shawl as she walked toward the table. She moved with slow grace despite the pain. Asha followed a few steps behind, more hesitant, keeping the blanket high around her chest and watching Elias with careful eyes. They sat at the table across from him. He kept his hands to himself, focusing on the kettle and the small pot warming in the fire. He poured broth into tin cups and slid them forward one at a time. Lona lifted hers with steady fingers. Asha took hers but didn't drink immediately, waiting to see Lona's reaction first. When Lona swallowed and nodded at the warmth easing her throat, Asha finally drank. Elias leaned back slightly against the counter, arms crossed loosely. He didn't ask who had done this to them. He didn't ask how long they'd hung there. He could see the answers in the bruises, in the rope burns, in the exhaustion etched into their movements. Asking would only force them to speak before they were ready. Silence was simpler. After several long minutes, Lona set her empty cup down, her hands resting lightly against the wood. She cleared her throat once. "You found us," she said softly. Elias nodded. "You cut us down?" Another nod. Asha looked at him sharply, as if waiting for the rest, but Elias didn't add anything. He just shifted his weight and adjusted the sleeve that had slipped down his arm. Lona studied him quietly, her gaze moving from his burnished skin to the tired set of his shoulders. Something in her expression softened. She didn't thank him with words. She simply bowed her head once, a gesture small but deeply meant. Asha hesitated, then mirrored her sister's gesture, though hers came stiffly, as though giving that much trust cost effort. Elias looked away for a moment, not out of discomfort, but out of habit. He wasn't used to being looked at so directly. After they finished eating, he stepped outside to chop kindling, giving them space. The door stayed open behind him. From the yard, he could hear the faint movements of the women inside. Blankets being folded, quiet murmurs between sisters, the soft scrape of the chair shifting across the floor. The sun rose higher, coloring the dry plains in warm gold. Elias swung the axe with steady, even strikes. He didn't look back often, but each time he did, he saw Lona standing just inside the doorway, holding the blanket she had folded neatly, watching him the way someone watched a place that might become safe. Asha sat near the hearth, shoulders wrapped tightly, her eyes following both him and the open land behind him, as though trying to measure which direction danger might come from next. When he brought the kindling inside, Lona stepped back to give him room, but she didn't hide the way her eyes lingered on his movements, slow, careful, deliberate. Asha avoided meeting his gaze, but she didn't flinch when he passed near her anymore. The day moved quietly. No one talked unless necessary. Lona helped sweep dust from the floor with a small bundle of sagebrush she found by the wall. Asha stacked folded blankets carefully in a corner. Elias mended the ripped neckline of Lona's dress with a needle and thread, sitting by the window where the light was strongest. When he handed the dress back to her without a word, Lona held it gently, fingertips brushing the clean stitches, her eyes softening in a way that spoke of gratitude without needing a single sound. Outside, the sky stayed a deep and steady blue. Inside, the cabin felt fuller, warmer, lived in. By evening, as the fire crackled and the plains darkened beyond the window, the three of them moved around each other with a quiet rhythm that hadn't been there the night before. Not familiarity yet, not trust, but something forming, slow and fragile, carried in silence rather than speech. And for the first time in many seasons, Elias Ward did not sit alone at his table as night settled over the land. The morning broke with a cold breeze slipping through the gaps in the cabin's shutters, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and the faint rattle of leaves outside. Elias Ward was already awake, sitting on the edge of the porch with his hat pushed low, watching the horizon where the first line of pale light crept over the ridge. His breath came slow and even, the same pace he used for everything, though his eyes were sharper than usual, shifting between the hills and the open plain as if expecting movement. Inside the cabin, Lona stirred first. She sat up quietly, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair falling loose from the braid that had partly come undone in the night. She looked toward the doorway where Elias sat silhouetted by the early light, his back broad, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a small tin cup of coffee. For a long moment, she simply watched him, the quiet steadiness of him, the way he seemed as much a part of the morning as the rising sun. Asha woke with a softer sound, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, her eyes still wary. She followed Lona's gaze toward the doorway, and though her shoulders tensed, she no longer flinched at the sight of the man who had brought them here. She watched him with a cautious, measuring look, her breath shallow but controlled. Lona rose, walked slowly toward the door, and paused behind him, not too close, but close enough that her presence reached him. Elias didn't turn immediately, but he shifted slightly, leaving a bit more space on the porch bench, a subtle acknowledgement that didn't require words. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice low and rough from the cold air. Lona nodded once, stepping out onto the porch to sit near him. She pulled her blanket tightly around her, looking out across the plain where the dry grasses swayed in muted colors. Her breaths steadied with the quiet. Asha remained inside a moment longer before stepping to the threshold, still barefoot, still wrapped in the same blanket. She hovered there, watching the two of them, deciding if she felt safe enough to join. Elias didn't look at her, but his silence left the choice open. After a few seconds, she stepped outside and sat on the top step, keeping a small distance but no longer hiding behind the door. The three of them sat that way for a long time, watching the sun rise over the open land. When the light grew stronger, Elias stood up and went to the small corral beside the cabin to check on his horse. The women watched him move across the yard, slow, unhurried, every step grounded. Lona's eyes softened as she saw the way he touched the horse's neck, quiet and respectful. Asha watched too, but her gaze darted often between Elias and the ridge behind the homestead, still expecting danger from a direction she couldn't name. Inside, the cabin warmed quickly once the fire was lit. Lona ground dried corn with steady motions while Asha added water to the pot, her hands trembling only slightly. Elias worked outside for most of the morning, checking the barn door, patching the fence, stacking wood, but he came back inside often enough to be sure they were managing. He never rushed them. He never asked more than a quiet, "You need anything?" spoken without expectation. When he mended Asha's frayed skirt by the window, she stood nearby, not speaking, watching his hands as he guided the needle through the leather. His movements were slow, careful, respectful. When he handed it back, folded neatly, she took it without meeting his eyes, but her whisper of thank you was barely audible, carried as much by breath as by voice. Lona helped stir the pot, her movements steady, her presence soft but sure. She glanced toward Elias often, especially when he moved near the fire, as though checking on something she didn't know how to name yet. By midday, the three of them shared a simple meal. It wasn't lively or loud. It wasn't meant to be, but they sat together, Elias at his usual place, Lona at the side, Asha opposite her, each close enough to feel the warmth of the hearth and the presence of the others. The silence among them felt different now, not empty but settled. Later, while Elias stepped outside to bring him more water, Asha paused in her sweeping and spoke to Lona in a low voice. "He is quiet," she murmured, glancing toward the door. Lona nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Quiet is good," she said softly. "Quiet leaves room to breathe." Asha didn't reply, but she looked at the door again with a slightly different expression, one that wasn't fear, but something closer to cautious trust. When Elias returned, he found both women tending to the small space near the hearth. Lona folding blankets neatly, Asha setting the woven baskets back in place. Something about the scene slowed his steps. The cabin, which had felt empty for so long, now looked lived in, warm, held together by more than wood and nails. The afternoon light slanted across the yard, and Elias stepped to the porch, scanning the ridge out of long habit. His jaw tightened just slightly. Something had unsettled him. Lona stepped out a second later, noticing the shift in his posture. He stood straighter, his body angled subtly between the cabin and the open land. "Riders?" she asked quietly. He shook his head but kept watching the horizon. "Didn't see any, but it's too still." Asha appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide for a moment before settling on Elias's back. Even from inside the cabin, she could sense the change in the air, the way a person accustomed to danger could feel it before it arrived. Elias didn't raise his gun. He didn't call out. He simply stood, calm and unflinching, his presence forming a barrier between the women and the empty hills. The moment stretched, then eased when the wind picked up again and a pair of distant birds lifted from the brush. Nothing more. Elias's shoulders softened. He exhaled. Lona stepped beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth through the thin blanket draped around her. She didn't touch him, but her nearness was deliberate, an unspoken acknowledgement that she saw what he carried inside and why he watched the land the way he did. Asha lingered just behind them, her eyes on the same ridge now, not with fear, but with shared understanding. The day ended quietly, but something had changed. The three of them moved through the small cabin with new awareness of each other. Elias caught Lona watching him as he stoked the fire. She turned away only when he looked back, a slight warmth rising in her cheeks. Asha took the water cup from his hands more calmly than before, her fingers brushing his for the first time without flinching. And when night finally settled over the plain, the cabin no longer felt like a man's shelter shared with two strangers. It felt like the fragile beginning of a household built from survival, silence, and the small, steady acts that held people together. The fourth morning began with a faint chill that drifted across the plain and into the cabin through the cracks in the shutters, carrying the dry smell of sage and the distant sound of something moving through brush. Elias Ward was already awake, sitting near the small table with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. The fire snapped lightly behind him. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on a half-lit yard outside the window, as if measuring the shape of every shadow. Lona stirred on the bed first. She pushed herself upright with a soft, controlled breath, her body still sore, but no longer weak. Her hair, brushed out the night before, lay loose along her back except for the single braid she had redone with practiced fingers. She watched Elias for a moment. How still he was, how his eyes moved without his head turning. Then she rose, adjusting her repaired dress and pulling her blanket around her shoulders. Asha woke later, slower than usual. She winced as she sat up, rubbing the marks around her wrists, but she didn't hide the pain. Her eyes scanned the cabin, then found Lona, then settled briefly on Elias near the window. Something in her posture softened at the sight of him. Not trust yet, but a sense that she no longer expected the world to swing against her every second. Elias set the cup down and stood, the old chair scraping faintly against the wood floor. He didn't interrupt their waking. He simply moved toward the hearth and stirred the fire until it brightened, filling the room with warm light. "There's water heating," he said quietly. "Eat when you're ready." Lona nodded once, stepping toward the small table. Asha followed, still keeping a cautious distance, though her steps were more even than the day before. They sat while Elias ladled warm corn mash into 3 tin bowls. Asha watched his hands again, the slow, controlled movements, the careful way he placed each bowl in front of them without leaning too close. Lona offered a gentle nod as she accepted hers, and Asha murmured something soft in her language that carried gratitude even if Elias didn't understand the words. For a while, the only sound was the quiet scrape of spoons and the low breath of the fire. Then Lona lowered her spoon and spoke. "We will work today," she said, her voice calm, decisive. Asha's head dipped in agreement. Elias regarded them a long second. "You don't need to," he said. Lona met his eyes. "We cannot sit still forever. Our bodies stay weak if we do." Asha added in a small voice, "And we want to help. Your home, it has space for our hands." Elias didn't argue. He simply gave a short nod and rose from the table. Outside, the sun was climbing slow and steady, the sky clear and pale blue above the open plain. The light caught on the woodpile, the corral rails, the dry earth scattered with hoof prints. The air held a quiet that felt almost too fragile to disturb. He led them first to the small shed behind the cabin. The latch had come loose again, and he knelt to fix it while the women stood nearby. Lona watched every motion, her eyes following the twist of the hinge, the placement of each nail. Asha stayed closer to the door, her hands holding the blanket around her shoulders, but her gaze flicked often toward the hills as though unable to shake old habits of scanning for threats. When Elias finished the latch, Lona stepped forward, surprising him slightly, and brushed dust from the hinge with her palm, testing it with a gentle tug. "Strong," she said, her voice low. Asha found a broom inside the shed and began sweeping the porch without being asked. Her strokes were short, careful, but determined. Elias glanced once toward her, not to correct her, just to see that she was managing. For a time, the three worked in a quiet rhythm. Elias chopped wood near the corral. Asha swept the yard and porch. Lona hauled water from the barrel, steady and sure despite the strain. Every so often Elias paused to watch them. Not openly, but enough to notice small details. Lona's shoulders straightening as strength returned, the way Asha's eyes softened when she turned toward Lona for reassurance, the shared glance between the sisters when they realized they were safe enough to move freely. Later, when the sun reached midday, Elias repaired the strap on Asha's moccasin. She sat on the porch step, hesitant but still, while he worked with slow hands. Asha kept her eyes on the horizon, but the stiffness in her shoulders eased when she realized he wasn't going to rush or touch more than necessary. Lona stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold, her expression unreadable but warm. When he finished, he placed the moccasin beside her foot without speaking. Asha blinked once, then slipped it on. It fit better than before. She nodded slowly, a quiet gesture of thanks. Elias dipped his head in return. The day continued like that. Small tasks, shared spaces, silence holding everything together. Late in the afternoon, clouds gathered low over the ridge, shifting the light across the plain. Elias walked to the porch again, his gaze tightening as he studied the darkening horizon. He didn't call out, but Lona saw the change. She stepped beside him, her blanket wrapped around her arms, her breath steady. "You see something?" she asked softly. "Not yet," he said, "but the wind's turning." Asha stepped into the doorway, looking toward the ridge where the clouds rolled slowly across the sky. She didn't hide her unease this time. "Someone could follow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias shifted, placing himself just slightly in front of both women. Not dramatic, not protective in a showy way, just a quiet, instinctive movement shaped by years of living with danger at his back. "No one gets close without me knowing," he said. Lona watched him, her eyes lingering on the firm line of his jaw, the steadiness in his posture. "You look for danger even when the land is quiet," she murmured. "Old habits," he replied. Asha studied him too, her expression softer than before. "Old habits keep us alive." Elias didn't answer, but the faint breath he released showed he accepted the truth of her words. When the first drops of cold rain fell, the three of them moved inside the cabin. Elias fed the fire until the room warmed. Lona laid out the blankets. Asha closed the shutters one by one. None of them spoke much that evening. But when Elias sat near the hearth, polishing the knife he had used to cut them down, Lona sat at the table with her hands resting in her lap, watching him with a calm steadiness that wasn't fear or distance anymore. And Asha, for the first time, fell asleep without jerking awake at the sound of the fire shifting. The storm outside grew heavier, wind rattling against the walls. But inside the small cabin, the warmth held strong, and for the first time since the canyon, the two women allowed themselves to drift into rest, knowing the man across the room would remain awake long enough to keep watch. The household, strange as it was, fragile as it felt, was beginning to take shape. The rain drifted out sometime before dawn, leaving the plain washed clean and smelling faintly of wet dust and mesquite. A thin layer of fog clung to the low ground around the cabin, drifting in slow ribbons as the sun tried to break through. Elias Ward stepped onto the porch with his rifle resting loosely in one hand, boots damp from the night's moisture. The sky reflected faintly in the shallow puddles scattered near the corral. He took a long breath, scanning the land the way a man did when he wasn't sure what the night might have carried closer. Nothing moved except a distant jackrabbit darting through brush and the slow rise of fog along the ridge. Satisfied, he leaned a rifle against the post and knelt to check the wood stack, turning each piece to see which had stayed dry. Inside, Lona was already awake. She knelt by the hearth, stirring the embers back into life. Her movements slow but steady, her hair tied loosely behind her back. She wore the mended deerskin dress Elias had repaired, the fresh stitches running neatly along the neckline. Her breath puffed lightly in the cold air before the fire caught and warmed the space again. Asha woke to the sound of Elias's boots on the porch planks. She sat up slowly, rubbing her wrists as if easing the stiffness left by the rope's days earlier. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the neat repair on her skirt. She watched the doorway with the same instinctive caution she never seemed to fully let go of, but when Elias stepped back inside carrying dry wood, her posture didn't tighten the way it used to. "You slept some," Elias said quietly while setting the wood by the hearth. Asha nodded. "The storm, it hid sounds." She hesitated, then added, "Makes it easier." Lona looked up briefly, studying her sister with a mixture of pride and worry. Asha rarely admitted anything. Elias didn't comment. He simply added wood to the fire, the warm crackle filling the cabin. Breakfast was quiet but comfortable. Lona helped stir a pot of warm beans while Asha cleaned the tin bowls from the night before. Elias moved around them with a kind of practiced gentleness that neither woman missed. They didn't speak much, but the silence felt different, shaped by work, not fear. After they ate, Elias went outside to check the fence line closest to the cabin. Lona followed, stepping into the thin morning light with her blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't walk beside him, but a few paces back, watching the way he tested each fence post, how he set the hammer against loose nails with slow pressure. The sharp crack of metal against wood echoed across the quiet plain. "You fix everything twice," she observed softly. "It stays fixed that way," he replied. He turned then, catching her watching his hands. Their eyes held for a brief, quiet moment. Lona didn't look away. There was no rush in her gaze, no fear, only the steady recognition of a man who lived carefully because life had made him cautious. Asha joined them a few minutes later, stepping lightly across the damp ground. Her eyes scanned the ridge and the brush behind the corral before she approached. Elias noticed the way she looked over her shoulder often, but her breaths came steadier now. When a gust of cold air hit, Asha wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and moved closer to Lona. "We help more today," she said firmly. "There isn't much to do," Elias answered. Asha shook her head. "There is always something." Lona stepped past him and began peeling bark from a fallen branch. "Show us," she said. Elias paused, then nodded. He led them to the small garden patch near the shed where the summer's leftover rows sat dry and thin. They began clearing the soil, Lona loosening the earth with her hands, Asha collecting old weeds and carrying them to a pile behind the cabin. Elias watched them work, surprised at the silent coordination between them. They didn't speak, but they moved around each other with ease, as if falling back into habits from a life before the canyon. At one point, Asha's blanket slipped from her shoulders, exposing her arms to the cold air. She stiffened, but before she could pull the blanket back up, Elias stepped forward and draped his own coat around her. He didn't touch her skin. He didn't speak. Just placed the coat carefully and stepped back. Asha froze, startled. Lona stopped working and watched her sister closely. Asha held the coat edges in her hands, the warmth of it sinking in slowly. She lifted her eyes to Elias, searching his expression, finding nothing except simple concern. Her voice trembled slightly. "Thank you." Elias nodded once. Cold morning. Asha swallowed and continued working, her breath steadier than before. By midday, the fog had lifted. The sun cast pale, sharp light across the plain. Elias repaired the corral rails while Lona swept debris from the yard. Asha hung their blankets on the porch rail to dry, glancing toward the ridge only occasionally. Later, as Elias carried a bucket of water toward the cabin, he saw Lona standing by the doorway, hands folded loosely in front of her, watching him in a calm, open way that made him slow his steps. She didn't move when he approached, She simply waited for him to reach her. "You keep watch," she said softly. "Habit." She looked toward the ridge. "Your habits keep us safe." Their eyes met again, longer this time. Elias saw something steady in her gaze, a quiet strength that hadn't shown itself fully until now. Lona held his eyes without flinching, her breath slow, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been since the canyon. Inside the cabin, Asha watched through the window, her expression softening as she saw the way her sister eased closer to the man who had pulled them from death. Evening fell slow and amber across the land. The three of them ate together at the small table. Asha sat closer to the fire now, no longer flinching when it cracked. Lona helped Elias clean up afterward, their movements naturally aligning, passing tin cups back and forth without needing to speak. Before night settled fully, Elias stepped outside one last time. Lona followed to stand beside him, both of them watching the dim horizon where shadows stretched quietly. "You think danger will come?" she asked. He breathed slowly. "I've learned to expect it." Lona's voice lowered. "We stay. We do not run." The words were simple, steady, without fear. Elias looked at her then, not quickly, not startled, just deeply, and something in his eyes shifted, a weight easing, a wall lowering by an inch. "Then I'll keep watch," he said quietly. "And we will keep this home alive," she answered. Asha stepped into the doorway behind them, wrapped in Elias's coat, watching the two figures standing in the fading light. The night felt different, warmer, steadier, held together by more than survival. The beginnings of belonging had taken root. The sixth morning opened with a long stretch of quiet across the plain, the kind that settled deep into the dry ground and made every sound feel sharper. Elias Ward stepped out of the cabin just as the first thin light touched the ridge, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil left by the previous day's rain. He moved toward the corral with slow, deliberate steps, checking the rails with his hand, running his palm along the wood to feel for cracks the night might have widened. Inside the cabin, Lona folded the blankets neatly at the foot of the bed, her movements calm and steady. Her hair was tied back into a single braid again, falling down her spine in a smooth line. The repaired seam of her dress lay clean against her chest, the neckline sitting properly where rough hands had once torn it. She paused near the window, watching Elias for a moment through the glass. How he stood alone in the early light, how his shoulders held a weight she didn't yet fully understand. Asha woke slower that morning, rolling to her side with a soft groan. Sleep had been easier for her lately, but her body still carried traces of strain. She sat up and rubbed her arms, then glanced toward her sister. "He is awake before the sun again," Asha murmured. "He does not sleep deeply," Lona replied. Asha lowered her eyes. "He waits for danger." Lona didn't disagree. She stepped toward her sister and placed a soft, steadying hand on her shoulder before they both left the bed to start the morning. By the time they stepped outside, Elias was already carrying water from the barrel to the trough. The fog had burned away, leaving the sky an even shade of blue stretched above the open land. Asha wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and stood beside Lona, grateful for the warmth in the sun's first rays. Elias set the bucket down and turned toward them. "Morning," he said. Lona nodded. Asha lifted her chin in acknowledgement, still quiet but no longer hiding behind blankets or corners. They spent the early hours cleaning the yard. Lona gathered fallen mesquite branches while Asha sorted them into piles, occasionally glancing at Elias to make sure she was doing it right. Elias didn't correct her. He watched her a moment, then resumed tightening the rails of the corral. When he hammered a loose nail into place, Asha flinched at the sharp sound. Her shoulders tightened, and she stepped back automatically. Elias noticed and paused, lowering the hammer gently. "Just a rail," he said quietly. Asha nodded, her breath unsteady but improving. Lona moved closer and placed a hand on her sister's arm, grounding her. Elias returned to the work, but with softer strikes, mindful of the impact each sound carried. Later, as the day warmed, Elias brought out a small leather pouch containing needles and sinew thread. He carried it to the porch, where Lona sat with one of the blankets on her lap, checking the edges for fray. "I can mend that," he said. Lona looked up. We can do it together. She moved slightly to give him space. Elias sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He threaded the sinews slowly while Lona held the blanket steady, their movements quiet and matched. Asha watched from a few steps away, her arms folded around herself, her expression caught between curiosity and something softer. The stitching took time. Elias worked with careful hands, pulling each thread smooth. Lona guided the fabric, her fingers brushing as now and then, not by accident, but not boldly either, small, natural touches formed by shared work. Elias didn't pull away. He didn't speak, but his breathing slowed, his posture settling slightly, as though the nearness wasn't unwelcome. Asha approached after a while, holding her own torn blanket. She hesitated before speaking. Can you fix mine too?" she asked quietly. Elias looked up, then nodded. "Bring it over." She stepped closer, laying the blanket between them. Her hands trembled only a little this time. Elias made room for her on the porch step. Asha didn't sit beside him, but she knelt close enough that he could hand her the thread to hold steady. Working together in silence, the three of them mended the blankets. The cabin behind them glowed with warm sunlight, and the steady rhythm of needle through cloth created a soft, grounding pace that calmed the air. By afternoon, the blankets were folded neatly near the door. The three of them ate a simple meal of beans and dried corn, the quiet between them light and settled. Afterward, Elias stepped outside to check the ridge again. Lona followed, wiping her hands on her dress as she joined him. "Still worried?" she said, her voice soft. Elias didn't deny it. Storms make riders restless. And people. Lona stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm gently. "We faced worse before," she said. "We will face worse again." He looked down at her, not with fear, but with a hint of the weight he carried. Lona held his gaze steady. "You are not alone," she said. Asha stepped into the doorway then, watching them from a distance, her eyes softer than they had been since the canyon. Elias took a slow breath, his chest rising with something closer to acceptance than tension. "I'm starting to see that," he said. As evening settled, the three of them worked together preparing the cabin for the night. Elias checked the shutters. Lona arranged the blankets near the hearth, and Asha smoothed the floor with careful sweeps of sagebrush. The fire crackled steady and warm. When darkness finally wrapped the plain, they sat together in the glow of the hearth. Asha's head rested lightly against Lona's shoulder, and Lona's hand rested on the blanket between them, close to Elias's knee, but not touching. The silence between the three was no longer shaped by fear or uncertainty. It was beginning to feel like home. The seventh day began with a sharp, bright light spilling over the ridge, cutting across the plain in long, steady lines that reached the cabin before the warmth did. Elias Ward stood at the edge of the yard with a bucket in one hand, studying the horizon with a steady stillness. The night had been quiet, but he always checked the land at first light, his eyes moving from one ridge to the next with the practiced habit of a man who had once lived by knowing what moved in the distance before it reached him. Inside the cabin, Lona tied her braid tighter and smoothed her dress, the mended neckline lying clean and neat across her chest. She stepped to the doorway, watching Elias for a moment. The way he stood, firm, alert, yet carrying a weight beneath the surface, drew her forward with quiet concern. Asha was slower to rise. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her wrists as she always did in the mornings, loosening the stiffness left from the ropes. Her eyes moved carefully across the cabin, as though checking each familiar corner. When she noticed Lona watching Elias, she followed her sister to the doorway. "He watches the land as if it might turn against him," Asha whispered. "Old scars," Lona answered softly. Elias turned at the sound of the door opening. He dipped his head once in greeting, but the tension in his jaw didn't ease. "Something wrong?" Lona asked. "No sign of trouble," he said. "But the quiet, it's too even." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Lona understood the way a still plain could make a man's instincts rise, especially a man who had seen danger come from silence too many times. Breakfast came slowly. Lona cooked, stirring the pot with smooth movements. Asha folded the blankets. Elias stayed by the window, not eating until the women sat down. When they finally joined him at the small table, the room felt close but warm. Halfway through the meal, Asha paused, her spoon hovering over the bowl. "Someone was here," she said suddenly. Elias looked up, alert. "Where?" Asha pointed toward the back of the cabin. "I heard steps before dawn. Light, careful, not animal." Lona's hand tightened around her bowl. Elias rose from the table, grabbed his coat, and stepped onto the porch. Lona moved behind him, Asha staying close to her side. Elias searched the ground, crouching near the shed. Lona held her breath as she watched him brush his fingers lightly across the soil. A moment later, he stood. "Tracks," he said quietly. "One person." They stopped near the window. Asha's breathing quickened. Looking inside, "Maybe," Elias said, his gaze sharpening as he studied the ridge again. But they didn't come close to the door. Lona's eyes shifted toward the surrounding land. "Could be from your past?" she asked. "Could be from theirs," he answered. He didn't blame the women. He didn't fear them. He simply spoke truth. That truth hung in the air as they returned to the cabin. For most of the morning, Elias worked near the cabin rather than out in the fields, his movements slower but more controlled. Asha stayed near the fire, her eyes flicking to the window every few minutes. Lona helped Elias mend a rope line, handing him tools with quiet steadiness. Their hands brushed more often now, not by accident, not boldly, but naturally. By midday, the tension had eased, but only slightly. Asha stepped outside with a basket to gather dry brush. When the wind shifted suddenly, she stiffened, her fingers gripping the basket tightly. Elias noticed the change and walked toward her, keeping his pace unhurried. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Asha looked at him for a long moment. "Safe is new." His voice stayed low. "New things aren't always bad." She nodded once and returned to her task, her shoulders loosening as she worked. Meanwhile, Lona swept the porch, glancing toward the hills often. When she found Elias standing beside her, she didn't startle. His presence was something she had come to expect. "You think they will come back?" she said. "I think someone was curious," Elias answered. "Curiosity doesn't always mean harm." Lona's eyes softened. "But you prepare for harm anyway." He nodded. "That's how I've stayed alive." Lona stepped closer, the broom resting lightly against her shoulder. "You're not alone now," she said softly. Elias met her gaze, the steady light in her eyes pulling him inward. "I know," he said, quieter than before. The day moved into late afternoon, with the three working closer to the cabin than usual. Elias cut wood. Lona organized the shelves inside. Asha sorted supplies by the hearth, humming under her breath, a sound so soft Elias paused to make sure he wasn't imagining it. When evening settled, a pale orange glow spread across the plain. Elias lit the lantern while Lona stirred another pot of beans. Asha sat near the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the flames with a calm that had taken days to grow. After they ate, Elias stepped outside again, scanning the ridge one last time before night fully took the land. Lona followed after him, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stood beside him, close enough that he felt her warmth in the cold air. "Still see nothing?" she asked. "No," Elias answered, "but I'll keep watch." She looked up at him, her voice steady. "We face danger together now." He turned slightly toward her then, the lantern light catching the curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in her posture. Their faces were close, closer than before, though neither moved fully into the space between them. Instead, Elias's hand lifted slowly, as though unsure he should finish the movement. He brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. Lona didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her breath deepened, steady and sure. Asha watched from the doorway, wrapped in Elias's coat. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fear. She simply observed, understanding something important was taking shape. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Outside, the dark plain stretched silent and wide. And on the small porch of Elias Ward's homestead, the fragile beginnings of trust deepened. Not through words, not through promises, but through presence, closeness, and the quiet certainty that none of them stood alone anymore. The eighth morning settled over the plain with a soft, gray light that dimmed the horizon rather than brightening it. The clouds hung low and unmoving, pressing the air flat and heavy. Elias Ward stepped outside before the women woke, the door closing behind him with a muted click. He stood still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the wide, colorless land, studying every dip in the ground, every slow ripple in the brush. The tracks from the day before were gone, washed smooth by the night wind, but the memory of them stayed sharp in his mind. He shifted his weight, listening to the quiet, waiting for something to break it. Nothing did. By the time he returned to the cabin, Lona was awake and kneeling by the hearth, stirring the fire back to life. Her braid hung over her shoulder, the strands neat, her face calm. When she glanced up and saw Elias, she straightened slightly, her eyes searching his for any sign of trouble. "Quiet," he said. "Too quiet, maybe, but nothing moving." Lona nodded, the tension behind her shoulders softening a little. Asha emerged from the bedroom a moment later, rubbing her arms against the morning chill, the repaired skirt brushing lightly against her legs. She moved toward the table cautiously, but her steps were steadier than they used to be. The three shared a silent breakfast, each caught in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up in small, hesitant bursts, brushing against the cabin walls like a warning carried on breath alone. When the meal ended, Elias stood from the table and reached for his coat. "I'm checking the south fence," he said. "Won't go far." Lona rose immediately. "We come." Elias hesitated, glancing from her to Asha. "No need for both of you out there." Asha stepped forward, her voice quiet but certain. "We stay close. Not far." It wasn't a request. It wasn't defiance. It was a truth spoken by two women who had known too well what happened when they were left alone and unprotected. Elias studied them for a moment, his jaw tightening just slightly before he nodded. "Stay on my left," he said. "Keep the cabin in sight." They walked across the yard together, the sky heavy above them. The south fence sat along a shallow slope. Elias checked each post, pulling at the wire, tapping nails into place. Lona gathered fallen branches. Asha stacked them neatly, her eyes scanning the ridge behind them now and then. The land remained still, but it was a tense stillness like something waiting. When Lona handed Elias another strip of rawhide to tighten a rail, their fingers brushed. It was nothing dramatic, just the natural exchange of work, but Elias paused, holding her gaze for a quiet second before they continued. Asha noticed, though she said nothing, the corners of her mouth turning ever so slightly in a mixture of understanding and relief. By midday, the sun broke faintly through the clouds. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, but his attention kept drifting back toward the cabin. "We head back," he said. Asha looked at him sharply. "You saw something?" "No," he answered, "but the land feels wrong today." They returned to the cabin at a steady pace. Nothing moved on the open plain, but Elias's posture stayed tense even as he stepped onto the porch. When he pushed the door open, he scanned the interior out of habit before letting the women in. Everything was untouched. He set his rifle against the wall. "Stay inside for a while," he said. Lona came to stand beside him. "We trust you," she said simply. Asha lingered nearby, listening. Elias looked at Lona's face, steady, warm, unafraid, and something in his chest eased, not fully but enough that he could breathe slower. The three spent the afternoon close to the hearth. Lona prepared a small pot of warm broth while Asha repaired a torn stitch in one of the blankets. Elias sat by the window, sharpening his knife with slow, even motions. His eyes moved back and forth between the land outside and the quiet scene inside. At one point, Lona walked over and placed a cup of warm broth near his hand. Her fingers grazed the back of his knuckles, light, intentional, steady. Elias looked up at her, his expression unchanged but his eyes warmer than before. "You guard us," Lona said softly. "Let us guard you too." He didn't answer out loud, but the knife slowed in his hand, and he set it down gently before taking the cup. That was answer enough. As evening fell, the clouds thickened again, turning the plain into a muted stretch of gray. Elias stepped outside only long enough to check the shadows along the ridge. When he returned, Lona and Asha were sitting close to the fire, the blankets draped over their shoulders, their faces calm. He stood in the doorway a moment, watching them. The firelight moved across their features. Asha's guarded but softening eyes, Lona's steady posture, their quiet presence filling the small cabin in a way nothing had before. For the first time in many years, Elias felt the edges of loneliness shift, replaced by something he couldn't yet name, but didn't push away. He stepped inside and closed the door, the soft latch falling into place behind him. The three ate dinner together, sitting close, the fire warming their hands and faces. Asha leaned her head lightly against Lona's shoulder. Lona's foot brushed against Elias's beneath the table. Not by mistake, not seeking more than what he could give at that moment, but simply acknowledging the truth of the space they now shared. Later, as the night settled over the land, Elias stoked the fire and checked the door one last time. When he turned, Lona was standing a few steps behind him, her blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. "You watch for danger," she said quietly. "But not everything outside wants to harm us." Elias met her gaze, his breath steadying. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll keep watch anyway." Lona stepped closer, not touching him, just close enough that he felt the warmth of her presence. "Then we stay beside you," she said softly. "All of us." Asha, half asleep by the hearth, opened her eyes and nodded once, confirming it without needing words. The cabin felt small but full, silent but safe, fragile but warm. And as the night deepened, Elias Ward understood for the first time that the shelter he had built in the middle of the empty plain was no longer just his. It was becoming theirs. The ninth day broke with a colder wind than usual, slipping low across the plain and pushing small spirals of dust across the yard. Elias Ward stepped out of the cabin before sunrise, his breath visible in the dim air, his coat pulled tight around his shoulders. The horizon was a narrow, pale line, the color of bone under a heavy sky. He scanned the land with slow, practiced movements, ridge, brush, fence line, corral, each detail taken in silently. The night had been restless, not dangerous, but unsettled, the kind of quiet that felt like it was waiting for something to shift. Elias felt it in his chest, a low, familiar weight that made him take each step with more caution than usual. Inside the cabin, Lona tied her braid tighter, listening to the wind rattle faintly against the shutters. Her eyes were calmer than when Elias first found her, but she still watched every shadow with careful attention. She stepped to the doorway just as Elias returned from his first sweep of the yard. "Something wrong?" she asked. He shook his head, just watching. Asha was sitting by the hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes already on Elias. She had woken before dawn, sensing the shift in the air too. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Tracks yesterday. Someone near the window. They could come back today." Elias didn't deny it. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and rolled his sleeves up, preparing for whatever the day decided to bring. The three shared a simple breakfast, but none of them relaxed fully. Every sound outside, the groan of the old barn door, the sudden caw of a raven, made Asha turn her head quickly. Even Lona paused once, her spoon hovering midair. Elias set his bowl down slowly. "I'll take the rifle outside," he said. "You stay in sight." The women followed him onto the porch. The plains stretched ahead, pale and wide, the wind kicking at the dry grass with uneven breaths. Elias stepped down onto the dirt, moving toward the corral, scanning the ridge again. Asha held her blanket close and watched the same direction he did. Lona stood behind her, steady, her hand resting lightly on her sister's shoulder. When Elias reached the far end of the yard, something caught his attention, a faint shift in the dust near the ridge. Not movement, not clear, just the kind of disturbance that didn't happen on its own. He straightened slowly, lifted the rifle half an inch. Lona noticed. Her breath tightened. "Someone—" Elias didn't answer at first. He watched the ridge a full minute, his posture rigid but controlled. Then he lowered the rifle. "No," he said. "Nothing now. Whoever it was, they're keeping distance." Asha's shoulders loosened slightly. Lona exhaled. But the closeness of danger, real or imagined, drew the three of them together more tightly as the morning moved on. They worked inside for most of the day. Lona sorted their small supply of dried herbs, smoothing each bundle with careful hands. Asha sat by the fire, mending one of Elias's shirts, the needle moving slowly between her fingers. Elias stood near the window, repairing a broken strap on his saddle while his eyes kept flicking outside. In the early afternoon, when the light warmed the cabin and stretched long shadows across the floorboards, Asha looked up from her sewing. "Why do you watch the land so much?" she asked Elias. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. He set the leather strap down and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Old habits," he said. "Before I lived here, I learned to expect trouble." Lona studied him across the table. "From your soldier days?" Elias's jaw shifted slightly, but he nodded. "I lost people," he said. "More than once. I didn't see it coming. I don't plan on letting that happen again." Asha's gaze softened, slow, quiet understanding. Lona stepped closer to him, her expression steady. "You don't carry that alone," she said. Elias looked at her, a long, silent moment passing between them. The fire crackled behind them, warming the room. Asha watched, sensing something shifting again. Without rushing, Lona reached out and touched Elias's hand. Her fingers rested lightly on his skin, offering presence rather than comfort, honesty rather than fear. Elias didn't pull away. His own hand turned slightly, enough that their palms met. Asha lowered her sewing, watching them with calm acceptance. No jealousy, no confusion, just recognition that her sister had found steadiness where none existed before. The rest of the day unfolded gently around that moment. Lona worked beside Elias as he sorted tools near the hearth. Asha helped grind corn for supper, her movements smoother, more confident. At one point, Elias moved behind her to reach a pot, and for the first time, Asha didn't tense or step away. She simply breathed deeper and stayed where she was. The household had begun to move in a single rhythm. By the time evening settled over the plain, the sky was streaked with muted colors. Elias stepped outside one last time, not in fear but habit. Lona joined him, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You don't see danger now," she said. "No," he replied, "but you still watch." He nodded. "I watch because you're here. Both of you." She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. "We watch too," she said, "not out of fear, out of belonging." Asha appeared in the doorway behind them, the firelight behind her casting a warm glow around her silhouette. "We stay together," she said softly. Elias looked at both women, strong, scarred, resilient, and something in his chest eased fully for the first time since he'd found them hanging from that mesquite branch. He stepped into the cabin with them, closing the door gently behind him. Inside, the fire warmed the small room. The blankets were neatly folded. The table was set simply. The three of them gathered close, sharing a quiet meal, sharing warmth, sharing breath. No outsiders came. No threats returned. No shadows broke the night. And as they sat together, the plain silent outside, Elias felt the truth settle into him. He was no longer a man living alone on the edge of the territory. He had a home, shaped by silence, strengthened by routine, held together by the two women who now sat beside him. The family they were becoming no longer felt fragile. It felt real. The 10th morning rose with a gentle light that softened the edges of the plain, turning the dry grass into a pale gold that shimmered quietly beneath the early sun. The wind was calm for the first time in days, carrying no warnings, no unsettled shifts, just the steady breath of a land finally at peace. Elias Ward stepped outside with slow, even steps, his coat hanging open, letting the warmth touch him while he scanned the ridge one last time out of habit rather than fear. Nothing moved. Nothing watched. Nothing approached. For the first time since he had cut Lona and Asha down from that mesquite branch, the land felt safe. Inside, Lona finished braiding her hair, tying the end neatly before smoothing her dress over her hips. Her posture was calm, her breath steady, her eyes soft in a way Elias had come to recognize, something between gratitude and quiet attachment that needed no words. Asha folded the blankets near the hearth, humming faintly under her breath, her movements relaxed, her shoulders no longer tense or anticipating danger. The cabin felt lived in now, warm, steady, whole, and the space between the three of them carried a comfort that had taken days of silence, work, and shared survival to build. When Elias stepped back inside, both sisters looked up. Lona's eyes held him for a long second before she spoke. "You saw nothing," she said, already knowing. "Nothing," Elias confirmed. "Ridge is quiet. Tracks never came back." Asha nodded, a slow, relieved breath leaving her chest. "Then danger is gone." Elias took off his hat and set it on the table. "Seems that way." The quiet that followed wasn't tense, not like before. It was the kind that came when people knew a decision had to be made and when they knew the moment for it had finally arrived. Lona stepped closer to Elias, her steps soft against the wooden floor. She stopped just in front of him, her hands resting lightly at her sides. Her voice was calm. "We cannot return to our tribe," she said. "What they did, what they believed about us, we do not belong there." Asha stood behind her, eyes steady, voice low. "We belong where we are treated as people, where we can live without fear." Elias listened, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he breathed slowly, deeply, as if something inside him had finally settled into place. "You're safe here," he said. "Both of you, as long as you want to stay." Lona took another step toward him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "We don't want safety alone," she said. "We want home." Asha joined her sister's side. "A place where our hands can work, where our hearts can rest, where you stand with us, not apart." Elias looked at both women. The strength in them, the quiet resilience, the way they had begun to fill every empty space in the cabin and in his life. His jaw tightened once, not out of fear, but out of emotion he rarely lets surface. "You already made this place a home," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to say it." Lona's breath caught, her eyes warming. She touched his hand gently. Not a question, not a request, but a statement of truth. Elias turned his hand and laced his fingers with hers, grounding the moment. Asha stepped closer, laying her hand over both of theirs. Her touch was light, steady, free of the fear that once shaped every movement she made. "We stay," Asha said softly. "We build," Lona added. "We live," Elias finished. Outside, the sky opened fully into a clear, bright blue, clean and calm. The three spent the rest of the morning working side by side. Lona gathered herbs to hang by the window. Asha swept the porch and laid out blankets to warm in the sun. Elias repaired the last broken rail of the corral, his movements lighter than the days before. When the day reached its warmest point, they came together on the porch. Elias stood between the two women, his hands resting lightly on theirs. The sun cast long lines across the yard, and the cabin behind them hummed with a low piece of a place finally claimed. Lona leaned into Elias, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. Asha stood close on his other side, her posture relaxed, her eyes warm. The three of them faced the open land, not as strangers joined by circumstance, but as a small, steady family shaped by survival, silence, and choice. No more tribes behind them. No more army ghosts in front of him. No more danger circling the ridge. Just a home. Just belonging. Just the quiet promise that the life they would build together, slow, steady, and shared, was theirs now, and nothing would take it away. The wind shifted softly, brushing against them in a gentle, approving sweep. And for the first time, Elias Ward let himself smile, small, quiet, real, knowing the long, solitary years of his life had finally ended. He was not alone. He never would be again.